Welcome, everyone, to the newest episode of the Chan's Interviewing Show, which is episode 1. Today, we're really honored to have renowned YouTube personality, author, translator Jeremy Deathblade here. It's hard to imagine someone who is unfamiliar with your work, but for the one or two people out there who are unfamiliar with you, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure, I will do that. And before I get started, I want to point out that I have an 8-month-old at home, and that's where I'm recording. So if at any point there's random screaming, sorry, there's not much I can do about it. But yeah, like you mentioned, I do have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/deathblade. And I actually have a video where I go into the story of how I became a translator and a writer. I specialize in Chinese fantasy genres. So that's wuxia, xianxia, and xuanhuan. And I introduce all that stuff on my channel as well. Basically, I moved to China. I lived there for a few years. I taught myself Chinese, and I stumbled by chance into being a translator as a full-time profession. And I've translated a lot of these fantasy novels from China. Recently, I've kind of taken a break from translating after about 5 years of doing it full-time. And I'm working on an original series that basically is taking all of my knowledge of China, Chinese culture, and the language and the fantasy genres that are unique to China, taking all of that and kind of mixing it with Western stuff to make a hybrid story I'm billing it as cyberpunk cultivation. So cultivation is referring to the mystical Chinese energy cultivation that leads to becoming an immortal being. So mixing that kind of stuff with cyberpunk, that's the series that I am working on, and I launched the first book in that series on March 1st. The next one's coming out April 15th, and there's going to be more coming throughout the course of this year and maybe next year, depending on how long it takes me to get through all of those books.
I definitely want to talk about your book more, but first, a little bit more about your translating background. How many books have you translated over the course of this career?
Well, if anybody's interested, they can go to my website, which is jeremybai.com, to see all of them. Basically, I started out just doing fan translating to improve my reading ability in Chinese. And I did 4 books, like all of them traditional novels, before I started doing it full time for money. And I basically have translated 3 series, and I call them series because they are serialized web literature. In China, the authors publish them online, and you read them on an app on your phone or on your computer. They usually pump out at least 1 or 2 chapters a day over the course of years. So the series end up being very, very long. I have 3 major series that I have translated. The first one is I Shall Seal the Heavens. Second one is A Will Eternal, which is also an anime now, or a donghua, which is Chinese animation. And then Sage Monarch. Between those, it's about something like 13 or 14 million Chinese characters. If you parse that into English words, it's probably something around like 10 million English words. And each one of those series by itself is give or take about as long as the Wheel of Time series. So if you're familiar with epic fantasy, Wheel of Time is one of the most popular and famous ones. Each of the series I have translated is roughly as long as that. So it's kind of like I've translated the Wheel of Time 3 times over in terms of the amount of words. Of course, it's kind of a little bit more complicated than that because the authors have to meet certain character counts in their chapters to make money. So in other words, they pad their stuff a lot. So in terms of the actual quality of that content, it's nowhere near the Wheel of Time. I would say maybe 2 or 3 sentences of a Chinese fantasy novel might be equal to 1 sentence of Western fantasy novel, depending on the author and the content. But at least in terms of the actual amount of content I have produced, it's about that much.
That's pretty interesting that you basically started as a hobby, which has now become your career. Do you still enjoy the process doing it now as much as you did when you started?
Well, that's a complicated question to answer because, like I mentioned, I'm actually taking a break from it. The answer to the question is that yes, I do enjoy doing it, but like anything, if you do have something that you're doing as a hobby, then you turn that into a full-time profession of some sort, it does change it. It's impossible for it to not change. Toward the end of my last project, which is Sage Monarch, I did get a little bit burned out, not because of the specific nature of the job, but because of the specific author. What happened with his series, in my opinion, is that as he got toward the end, he was starting to get a little bit burned out. I could tell. So that kind of affected me to some extent. his early chapters, I would say, were something like 70 to 80% of it being not filler content. By filler content, I mean repeating or adding in extra stuff to pad the word count. Toward the end, it was like almost the opposite. It was like maybe 30% to 40% was the actual content, and then a huge amount of filler. So for me, it was like really frustrating because I would be translating and I would translate a line and then I would translate another line and then I would translate a third line and say, didn't he already say this? And then I'd have to go back to check the other two lines and I'd say, oh yeah, he did say the same thing. And I try to make the end result a little bit smoother for the English reading audiences. So for me, the latter parts of that project turned into a huge amount of going back to check to see what was filler and then changing it and editing it. And that kind of stuff gets very, very repetitive. And so for the end of the last project, I was getting a little bit burned out. That said, I still am hoping after I do this original novel series to pick up another translation project because, yeah, I do really like it. It's a lot of fun.
I've seen, I think, the majority of your YouTube videos, and you can oftentimes have some fiery opinions, and it seems like you have a pretty high standard for like the quality of translation. Do you think you hold yourself to a higher standard than maybe some others do?
It's hard to say. There's a difference between literary translators and the kind of translator I am. I'm not a literary translator. Serialized web novels are pulp fiction at best. And so there's a bit of a divide between those who consider themselves trained academic translators and the people like me. So forgetting about those people, I would say that, yeah, I am kind of different. I got into it because I wanted to force myself to read Chinese to improve my language skills. But I really just liked it. And so I kept doing it for fun. In fact, I would say probably the vast majority of people who are doing it now, there are a lot of them who are just like, wow, I can do this. I want to make money. So they jump in and do it. And not that there's anything wrong with that. But the point is, they're not inherently passionate about the language aspects or the cool, like martial arts, fantasy kind of stuff. That's not why they got into it. And so I think that does affect their way of going about the translating work. There are some people who have kind of come at it from the same way I did, which was kind of just stumbling into it and liking it beforehand. But I would say that we're probably in the minority. And that's even more true considering that the big company in China that has the monopoly on this in China by far, they got involved on the English speaking side as well. And they have a website called webnovel.com. I'm not going to bash them, but they don't really care about it in terms of like being passionate about the creative side. It's 100%. They wanted to jump in and make money on it. So they were just going around hiring like just anybody from, it didn't matter how good their English was, how good their Chinese was per se. They were just throwing massive amounts of money around initially. When they started realizing, oh man, we can't just like literally throw any amount of money. So then they started trying to figure out ways to save money. And that was when they started going to like not Chinese translation houses and obviously not freelance Western translators, but like Indonesia, Singapore, places where people not only don't have very good English, but they don't necessarily have very good Chinese. And so this is all a roundabout way of saying there are a ton of translators out there who are just, they're off in some country, they don't care anything about it, and they're just getting this text and they're kind of like translating it and not doing it out of passion. If they find something they don't really know, they're not quite sure what it means, they look it up in a dictionary, pop it into Google Translate, then that's the term they use. And so if you go to webnovel.com, the vast majority of their translations, I'm not saying every single one, but the vast majority are bad. Many of them to the point of being so bad that you almost can't read it. You might as well just Google Translate it and it would be better. So,
yeah. Well, I think like your passion for the art of it and the accuracy of your translation, I think that shows through. I guess in a way, you're like standing up against the man, against webnovel.com. You're a little bit like Wang Fan rising up against this authoritarian government, which brings us to your new novel titled The Heretic Peacekeeper. And there's a subtitle there that I don't remember.
I have, let's see, this is actually a print proof of the hardcover. So it has
beautiful.
But yeah, it's The Nine Heavens and Ten Earths. That's the name of the series. The first book is The Heretic Peacekeeper.
You describe it as a cyberpunk / cultivation fantasy novel. What is a cultivation novel?
Interestingly, I just released a YouTube video entitled "What Are Cultivation Novels?" So you can go there for a
Okay.
secondary sort of like specific answer to the question. But basically, cultivation is referring to energy, chi cultivation in the body. It's connected to real life stuff like qigong. Some people might have heard about, which is real life, Chinese meditation and stuff like that. Obviously, this is a fictionalized take on it, and essentially, the characters in these novels practice some sort of energy cultivation to transform themselves into powerful beings. They don't initially become immortal beings, but what usually happens is they progress through various levels of cultivation to achieve essentially the status of being an immortal being. Sometimes it goes higher than that, though. In the novels that I translate, usually it starts out in some kind of a mortal world akin to the world we live in. Usually it's ancient China, basically. And then the character will start learning these techniques to become stronger. There's always fighting involved. And one of the key aspects is the leveling up. So if you're a Westerner reading these novels for the first time, it's a little bit different than if you're reading things like Wheel of Time, Lord of the Rings, or even if you read the Dungeons and Dragons novels like a Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms or something. In Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms, it's not like they're saying, wow, I have now reached level 2. I am much stronger. But in the cultivation novels, sometimes it's as outright leveling as that. Sometimes it's not quite as much, but you get the sense that they are going through levels like you would in a video game. And of course, there are many, many tropes and cliches and common things that happen in these novels, whether you're talking about the plot archetypes, the characters, and whatnot, that we could talk. I mean, my YouTube channel at this point has 70 videos just talking about these things, so I can't go into too much detail here. Suffice it to say, it's about becoming an immortal being. So my novel is taking that concept and mixing it with cyberpunk. Now, cyberpunk is also something that people who are knowledgeable about it can talk a lot about and explain many different key aspects. And there are certain cyberpunk elements that my novel might not have. But that said, if you start digging into what cyberpunk is and how it started, it's not as though there's like some universal cyberpunk code that's like, you have to have these elements for it to be cyberpunk. So I'm confident that even though it's not necessarily hitting every single typical cyberpunk trope, I feel that it has enough of them. And there are certain cyberpunk elements that have yet to be revealed. So in any case, I decided that it would be cool to fuse these things. I've had this idea for several years. One of the reasons it all started, which I haven't really said this anywhere publicly, is that when I was translating my project A Will Eternal, which is at this point, this was probably something like 3 or 4 years ago, I guess. I always will listen to music while I'm doing it, and I have YouTube Premium, so I will usually listen to playlists on YouTube. And for some reason, I ended up listening to a lot of synthwave and like 80s themed mixes on YouTube, and a lot of them are cyberpunk themed. And just subconsciously, I feel like it was like mixing in my head, and I started coming up with this idea of how cool it would be to mix those two. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and I also got to point out that I've liked cyberpunk for decades at this point, so it's not as though like watching these videos on YouTube was where I literally got the idea of cyberpunk. Just kind of in my mind subconsciously was mixing these ideas. How cool would it be to have the stuff that I'm translating kind of be in a different setting reminiscent of 80s and 90s cyberpunk? And so the setting in general is a dystopian future megacity where there's this kind of, it doesn't really get into a huge amount of detail about it in book 1, but there is your evil government for all intents and purposes that are controlling everybody. And the people who practice this immortal cultivation they're kind of like outlaws. For unknown reasons, the government does not want people practicing this immortal cultivation, and they're kind of hunted. There's there's like a mix between secret police and like Navy SEALs, sort of like, that are hunting them and try to find their wherever they're meeting secretly, and arrest them or kill them or whatever. So that's the basic concept. You have this gigantic mega city. It's more than a mega city, really. It's like cities stacked on top of cities, right. Where all humanity is kind of squished together in this world where on top of all of it is something called the Heavenly Curse, which is sending endless amounts of cursed rain down into these cities. And so it's always kind of raining. The rain can give you a curse, which again, not too much detail in book 1. Book 2, there's actually more reveals about what the curse is like. Everybody's kind of on the one hand, sort of suppressed and living in this police state. That said, the common citizens kind of don't really get that. They just kind of are living their lives. The life for the common citizens isn't really that bad. They're just, other than this curse and stuff, and whatever other
Other
secret
than
thing.
that.
Yeah. They're just kind of living their lives. And then the cultivators, the people who practice immortal cultivation, are called cultivators. They're kind of living in the shadows, trying not to be hunted down. And our main character is a homicide detective who is kind of very pro government, in the sense that he believes himself to be part of a system that's fighting for justice and all that stuff. He gets dragged into the world of these immortal cultivators, sort of against his will to some extent, and almost immediately he finds himself being the one that's hunted and having to make a decision of, does he kind of go down this path of learning about what the immortal cultivators are all about, or does he side with the government?
I think there's a lot of awesome world building in the book. It was just really fun to learn about the world they were in. And then the primary part is like the fight scenes, which also were just such a blast to read. I felt like I was reading action scenes from a movie. It wasn't just like, and then they fought. Like I could see what the character was doing. But then there's also sort of these deeper themes with the conspiracy plot that when you realize maybe you thought you were a good guy and you've been on the bad guy's side this whole time. There's no question there. I'm just praising you for the book.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad you like. I'll just two real quick things that I wanted to respond to. Number one, about the fight scenes. I'm glad you liked them. Part of it probably is because the novels I've translated for the past 3 years are, they're essentially, they're almost every other chapter about is a fight scene.
Yeah.
On the one hand, that has given me a lot of window into the mind of how to do fight scenes. Also, it's taught me a lot of things not to do. The two authors that I primarily translate have two very different styles of doing fight scenes, and it was actually seeing those two styles sort of like contrasted to each other when I switched from one author to another, that really gave me my own personal philosophy about good ways to do fight scenes. Another thing that was behind that, which I don't, as a person who's not super familiar with the cultivation novel side, you probably wouldn't have picked up on this, but there is a little bit of a difference between my main character and the typical main characters of these novels, in that I actually didn't make my main character the tank. And I did that on purpose because a lot of the novels, the main character is going to be out there just plowing through bad guys, fighting the enemy. My guy actually doesn't have any magical technique that is focused on combat. And on top of that, when it comes to the immortal cultivator people, they have actually enhanced strength and physique and stuff like that. So he literally just cannot fight them. And I kind of did that on purpose because I didn't want to have a tank MC just out there, blasting away the enemy. My guy has to kind of, to some extent, use his smarts, and he also does have technical martial arts abilities. It doesn't outright say it in the novel. I do mention in the second novel, but he essentially trains in jiu-jitsu, and so he knows like arm bars and different things like that. And so he has to kind of think of more clever ways to come through the fight scenes than just beat the bad guy up. So moving on from the fight scenes, the other thing I wanted to mention was that you were talking about the themes of the novel and stuff. Don't disagree with you on that at all, but I do want to make it. I do want to say that I didn't approach this novel or the series in general of like trying to send a message about something in any way. What I did was I built this world that I made a bunch of rules and situations and histories and different things like that. I tried to set everything up as complex as possible, but without making it too complex. As an aside, there's a great Brandon Sanderson is a really well-known author, and he has a lecture about world building, and he describes world building as like, he does a great visual. He draws like an iceberg, and then he says, if you have good world building, people look at the tip of the iceberg and they can look down into the water and they see there's much more behind there, and like, wow, this is so amazing. Then what he does is he takes the iceberg and he hollows it out inside, and he says that's what real world building is. Because if you wanted to, you could spend your entire life building every single detail of the world. What kind of pipes do they have behind the walls, and like all that kind of stuff. So the point is just, I think I built everything up in a way that is complex and believable enough that I could throw characters in there and then give those characters a personality and then see how they react to what it is. So to some extent, the actions of the characters and the main character who you're viewing the story through his eyes. I, to a large extent, did that in a discovery writer way. There's different theories about writing, and I'm lean more toward the discovery side, where, in other words, I'm kind of finding out the story as it's going along as well. Not every aspect, I do have it plotted out, but the characters' reactions and stuff to a large extent are his own. And so for me, it's also interesting to see how he reacts to these different things and how he, ends up making the decisions that he does. I don't want to make it sound like I had this super master plan regarding the voice of the character, but basically, because the vast majority of the novel is written in first person, that really does limit me in how I reveal the world. It's either stuff that he knows, that he tells you, or stuff that is told to him by the other characters. And because there is this kind of conspiracy, he doesn't know the truth kind of thing, and he's learning about the secret world around him. Because of it being in first person, I actually can only reveal it via dialogue, and that's difficult because you don't want to do like, well, Bob, we are robots. Yes, John, as robots, we can only do these. It's like that comes across really stilted. So it has been a little bit challenging to do that.
And given how little we know about what's going on around Wang Fan, it sounds like there's a lot more to reveal about this world that he's in.
There is a lot more to reveal in terms of the world building. I wanted to include as much as possible so that the reader didn't feel too confused, but at the same time, I didn't want to just blurt out everything. So I would say, in terms of how much the reader understands about the world, by the end of book one, it's probably something like 10% or maybe 15 or at most 25%, because there's a lot of history that hasn't been revealed, and also the true nature of the actual, I call it a megacity, but whatever you want to call it, the true nature of how it's constructed and how it works and stuff has not been revealed. There are a lot of clues depending on how you read. Like, for instance, there's a scene where the main character looks at a bookshelf, and the titles of the books, if you look at them closely, one of the titles has a very, very big clue about the whole nature of how these megacities are built. And I threw in little things like that in other places as well. So there is definitely a lot left to be described
Cool.
that will be revealed in the next couple books.
I'm glad you mentioned writing in first person. I wanted to ask if that's generally used in cultivation novels.
No, it's actually not that I'm aware of. And again, there wasn't some like super complex master plan behind it. I just thought it would be cool. One thing it also does is it gives you a little bit better access to the character's thoughts. It's not necessarily like you can do the same thing in third person, but also a lot of hard-boiled and detective novels. I vaguely recall being in first person. Also, I was reading Altered Carbon recently. It's in first person, and I kind of liked how it came across. And then also, like I was describing before, it does come with some challenges, which I knew about going into it, and I wanted to kind of challenge myself in terms of, how do I do the action scenes when the character is describing his own actions as the action scene? How do I do the world building when, like I was mentioning, most of it has to come from character dialogue? So there's a lot of stuff that I felt would be helpful in that, or not helpful, challenging, and I kind of wanted to challenge myself.
Will you translate your novel into Chinese?
I've had a lot of people ask me questions like that in the past, and basically no. There's no way my Chinese, I could make a stab at it, but it would be too slow and painful to do that. I would have to get somebody that is probably a native Chinese speaker, and then it would also require help from me, and because I have a lot of made up terms, it's cyberpunk, so we have
Right.
not non-standard words. Who knows, maybe one day. I have somebody translating it into Spanish. He has a team that he is building to translate novels. This is one of the first ones he's doing. I think he said it might already be done, so could be out in Spanish later this year as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading the first book again in English. Now you've mentioned some of these things, I'm going to go back and look for more clues. And it's really fun. I'm looking forward to reading again, and for book 2 on April 15th. Where should people go to find you? What should I put in the description?
Probably the most comprehensive is my website. jeremybai.com has links to all of my social media and all of the different things I've translated and written and all that kind of stuff.
Cool. I will put a link to that in the description. Thank you for your time. I apologize for my terrible questioning, but it was really gracious of you to spend this time with me. And best wishes on the book sales. And I'm looking forward to book 2.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast.